Hello and welcome to our fourth class in which we're going to reflect on the performativity of language. To do so, you have read two short texts. One was a summary of the book by Austin called How to Do Things with Words, which was published on 1962, so it's an older book. And then you have also read a text by Judith Butler from 1997 called Excitable Speech, A Politics of the Performative. Okay, let's start by Austin, who was a philosopher of language who lived in the 20th century and who is especially well known because he created what is called a speech act theory. And what is important for us about this is that he asked himself, okay, do all sentences, do all utterances in language describe? And he said, no, they do not all describe. They are not all true or false. Some of them are doing something different, right? Because instead of saying something, or better explained, while saying something, they are also doing something. So he noticed how words have the proper effect if uttered in the appropriate circumstances and if the participants are doing certain other physical or mental things. And he gave these three examples. For example, the first one being the bride and the groom who say "I do" in the church while getting married, and while doing so, those words "I do" are also the action itself of getting married. He also gives the example of naming a boat by breaking a bottle and saying, I name you Queen Elizabeth, right? So he divided these acts in different categories, which gets kind of complex. But what is important for us, as I would say, is to try to distinguish between what he called the illocutionary act and what he called perlocutionary act. And I'm pointing out this distinction specifically because it's going to be especially relevant for us in what we will be discussing later. So for him, and this is not completely exact, but I think it's very clarifying and can serve to understand this difference better. So for him, illocutionary acts are the things done in saying something. So as the example of the bride and the groom saying I do. And for him, the perlocutionary act are the things done by saying something. So this would refer to the effects something said has after being said. And he says that perlocutionary acts, like the effects these words can have, is not something that we can be really sure of, right? Okay, so let's retain this difference between illocutionary and perlocutionary. Let's now briefly turn to Bourdieu, who is a French sociologist, and you have not read him for today, but I just wanted to point out something that he said, which is very important in relation to our topic today, which is that, yes, okay, words, following Austin, he says, yeah, words do certain things, but to do those things, the person who says them must be entitled to do so, which means this person must have a recognized authority over the recipient of that order, right? So he reminds us that for this illocutionary acts to work, there must be a system by which the person who says these words is entitled to do so. Okay, let's now turn to the other reading, the one you did on Butler, who is another more recent philosopher of language and philosopher of different things. You must probably know her for her work on gender in her book Gender Trouble, in which she explains how gender is something that is constructed, right? That is like inscribed in our daily practices and which is learned and performed. So it's again the idea of performance. But here in this text that you have read, of which you have read some excerpts, she reflects about injurious language, starting from the works by Austin. So what is she trying to do in this text, which you may have found a bit difficult? She's trying to find some space, find some possibility to counter the power of injurious language. So to reconstruct the relationship between the victim of injurious language and her agency or his agency to answer to that situation, right? So she starts from Austin's work on performativity, and she also connects it to the work of another philosopher who is called Althusser, who talks about interpellation. And Austin mentions that too, right? So the idea is that Althusser's idea that she recovers here is that one comes to exist by virtue of the fundamental dependency on the address of the other. So we come into existence by being interpellated by the others. That's how we become social beings, because we are interpellated by others, social beings, and that's how we come into existence. So for her, injurious language has a very strong power, because it also brings us out to existence, but from that point of injury, right? So she goes back to the illocutionary speech act theory, and she reflects that, so illocutionary acts work when they are uttered in the moment they are said, but because of their quality of being ritualized, they are connected to a past. They have a history by which the people who participate in this illocutionary act recognize that history of those words and their power as an action, and that's the way those words can work as an action again. So when the bride says, "I do," that connects to a ritualized moment that has a past, a present, and a future. So it's never a single moment. And that trajectory for her, that total speech situation, for her, it's very interesting because it opens what she calls a gap. Okay? A gap that separates the speech act from its effects. Why? Because it has to connect to a past, and then because its consequences might come later. If we think, for example, and that's why I insisted before on the difference between illocutionary and perlocutionary, because perlocutionary refers to the consequences, right? If you remember, no? The things done by saying something. And these consequences do not always occur. So there is a gap, and this is the gap, the time and space and the gap that Butler identifies as possibility, right? Because if the link between the act and the injury, in this case, is a little bit loose, right? It opens up the possibility for what she calls a counter speech, a kind of talking back, right? Okay, so this interval, this gap which makes this repetition and this resignification possible, it also shows that how words might, through time, become disjoined from this power to injure by being recontextualized in different modes. I think here, for example, it helps to think about what has happened with the word queer in English, right? Because I think it has gone through through this um, through this process that Butler explains, right? It has been resignified by the people who were injured by it, and now it has different meanings in affirmative modes that have been created from the people who were injured by it in the past. Okay? So for her, this is very important because if we question that hate speech always works, and she says that that's not to minimize the pain that people suffer as a consequence of hate speech, but to think about possibilities of that failure as a condition for a critical response. So this philosopher of language, Judith Butler, in this sense, is against state-centered forms of banishing this kind of speech, hate speech, and proposes that a form of agency, and resistance from the victims of hate speech, of certain hate speech, is possible. Okay, so what she's doing is exploring kinds of counteraction, kinds of resistance, kinds of agency that are non-state centered. Okay, so this would be one position in the debate of how to legislate on hate speech, on which we will talk today, on which you will do your assignment today. Right? So her point of view in this debate is that even if hate speech, if injurious speech is wounds, right? And she says that, yeah, we don't even have vocabulary to describe the effects it has on us, that makes no physical reference, right? So we talk about being injured by language the same way we talk about being injured physically. So for her, it's very important, but her position, the hate speech is very important, and the injury it creates is real. But in this debate, she positions herself in finding possibility and space for resistance from the subjects. Okay? Great. So thinking about this debate of legislating on hate speech, the position that the European Union and the US have taken on this debate is very different. Okay? In the US, because of the importance of the First Amendment and what is called the free of speech, there is not a lot of legislation. So in that sense, hate speech is somehow protected in order to protect the First Amendment, right? On the other hand, in the case of Europe, hate speech is much more is much more condemned, legally condemned, to protect the rights of minorities. Okay, so these are two positions, and you're gonna read about two cases, two extreme cases, to think about the challenges of legislating about hate speech and to think about the risks that each position of legislating and not legislating, of protecting and condemning, the risks that these both positions entail. And you are going to reflect on that and to think about the challenges on legislating about that and giving your own point of view on the issue. Okay? Well, so these were difficult texts, but the objective of today's lesson is to start thinking about the power of language to do things. That is, the quality of language of being performative, of doing things itself. Okay? Well, thank you very much for watching the video. It was a bit long because today's lesson was more complicated, but we will continue reflecting on what language is, what language does. Today, it was more centered on what language does. Okay? Well, see you next week. Bye bye. Have a great week.